and so we'll be okay. So you tell me, if I have this thing, I have this list and front points to the first node, we're just leaving out the string nodes and just, you know, saying you understand that each one of these is actually pointing to a node, right? So, or sorry, pointing to a string that's separate. So we have the front pointing to the node that contains the string Chris, and then that points to Pat and that points to Lupe, but we want Dana to be at the front of the list. So what do I need to do and in what order? Notice that I have this reference called new node, right? I've created this new node. So this reference points to this newly created node in memory. And I want that one to be at the front before Chris. So what is the order in which I must do this thing?
Dana has to point to Chris first.
Okay, so Dana has to point to Chris first, right? So step number one is Dana points to Chris. What is the code for that? Let me go back to here. What is the code to make Dana point to Chris?
New node dot next equals front.
This stuff looks crazy when you're first getting into it, right? All of these things look like nonsense when you get into them the first time. New node dot next equals front, right? The new node's next pointer should point to the same thing that front currently points to, right? Point the new node's next reference to the same thing that front points to. Does that make sense? Okay, it's funky looking code, but that's what it does, right? What's the second step that we need to do?
Front needs to point to Dana.
That's right, front needs to point to Dana. So what is that code now? Front points at
New node.
Point front to the same thing that new node points at right now, right? Does that make sense? You have to read references well, or this stuff hurts your head, right? You have to literally say to yourself, points at the same thing as. Point front to the same thing that new node points to right now, right? That way, front is going to point to the Dana node, right? The node that contains the Dana data. Make sense? So number two, we do that, right? Then interestingly, number three happens when the new node goes out of scope, right? The variable new node goes out of scope because eventually we're going to finish this add method or addAtFront method, and that goes out of scope. So now, is that a problem for us though? When new node itself goes out of scope, is there any problem for the list, or is the list all safe?
I think it's all safe.
It's all safe. Why? Because front points to Dana, everybody's pointing to something, right? There's no orphans here. There's nobody unloved, right? Everybody's got a reference to it. So everything is safe. By doing this careful progression of code, we now have all of our stuff working to do addAtFront. Make sense? Any questions about that? That's literally the code in the method addAtFront, right? You give me the data and I will make a new node and then run these steps, and that will put it at the beginning of the list. Okay, what questions do you have about that?
You always add at the beginning, at the front.
You don't have to add at the beginning. This is just a method called addAtFront, right? We might want another method called addAtEnd. And if so, we'll do that in a little bit, and we have a different problem, and that's that we have to be at the end to add it at the end, right? addAtFront is easy because you're always adding it at the beginning. Okay. All right. Yep, Gary, that's another thing. Yeah, front, you have to think about front versus front.next. Yep. All right. Anybody else? Any other questions that you have here? Idris, is that good for you? Anything else you want to ask? Okay. All right, so now let's go actually write this code, right? We've talked about it. Let's go actually make this thing happen and write a linked list from scratch. It's not worth taking the author's code to do a simple linked list because we'll learn more if we do it ourselves. So I'm just going to come over here and we are going to make ourselves a linked list. So to get started with that, we probably want to make this generic. So I'm going to add an E on here, right? I'm going to make